What do you remember about your school building from high school? What was your classroom like? How many students were in your classroom with you? What were your teachers like? What were some things someone would see and hear if they stepped back in time and walked into that school? Thinking about our own experiences in school is actually a useful way to begin to understand how education is structured as a social institution. Just start with all the stuff that was in your classroom in your school. We could make a list of all the stuff that goes into schools. There's the obvious stuff, like a building, classrooms, electricity, heat, air, plumbing, Wi-Fi, lockers, bathrooms, science labs, and a library, athletic fields, cafeteria, auditorium, gymnasium, music room, playgrounds and related equipment if it's an elementary school, desks, tables, chairs, books and AV equipment, dry erase boards, markers and erasers, computers and digital tech of some kind. Then there's all the non-material stuff that still requires resources. Teachers and staff, preferably enough teachers to keep classes to a reasonable size. Enough support staff to provide a range of student services. Guidance counselors, administrative staff, custodial staff, assistant principals, and a principal. We need them all. That's a lot of stuff to have the very basic necessities of what could be considered a reasonably good school. Who pays for all of it? In short, for public schools, taxpayers do. But putting it that simply can be misleading, and we need to discuss exactly how resources get generated and distributed to fund schools in the United States. Like many things in social life, funding for public education is socially structured. That is, there are rules that dictate how funds for public schools get produced and directed to schools. In this case, the rules are laws, and they profoundly influence the amount of resources that different schools have access to. Schools that have ostensibly the same job, to educate young people. Now, a couple of things about these rules that are somewhat unique to the U.S. Public education in the United States has always been what's described as a decentralized system, especially when it comes to funding. The word education appears exactly one time in the United States Constitution, and that's in a sentence that says education shall be handled by the states. State and local governments administer the vast majority of education policy in the U.S. Compare that to a country like France that is a very centralized system. The Ministry of Education in Paris administers virtually everything there is to do with education in the entire country. Not so in the U.S. The fact that education is decentralized in the U.S. means that things look slightly different from state to state. The way things work in Illinois isn't exactly the same as they work in Indiana or Kentucky or North Carolina or New York, etc. But there are clear patterns of similarity in how public schools generate and distribute funds, and those patterns go like this. First, a major source of funding for local schools comes from local tax revenue, particularly property tax revenue. Now, I know what you're thinking. Ugh, taxes. Too complicated, I already don't understand. And I get it. Taxes in the U.S. tax code can be excessively complicated and boring, but a basic understanding of how school funding works doesn't require an accountant's or a lawyer's level of expertise. It's really pretty straightforward. The amount of the property tax revenue that can be generated depends on the value of the property being taxed, because the property is taxed as a percentage of its estimated value. Let's say you own a house and I own a house. My house is worth $100,000 and your house is worth $1 million. And let's say we both pay a tax rate of 1%. Even though we pay the same tax rate, we generate very different amounts of money when we each pay our property taxes. 1% of 100,000 is 1,000, but 1% of 1 million is 10,000. This is done by law. In addition, if my house is worth $100,000 and yours is worth $1 million, the chances that we are next door neighbors are slim, to say the least. There is an enormous amount of residential segregation in the U.S. based on social class differences. So, houses of roughly similar value are usually concentrated in the same areas. Districts where the overall property value is relatively high can generate substantial sums of revenue to fund their schools, compared to districts where the overall property value is lower. State governments also provide a major source of funding for public education. Side note, the federal government covers less than 10% of funding for public schools. Most states have some policy in place where they establish a floor of funding per student in the state, a minimum level of funding for all students. For poorer districts that struggle to generate sufficient funds for their schools, state governments supplement them with additional funds from state dollars to raise them up to that minimum, which varies by state. This is also done by law, a funding formula most commonly referred to as a foundation program. Note, however, while all states set a floor on the amount of funding that schools receive, there is no ceiling. What this means, in effect, is that many wealthier districts can spend as much money as they can generate for their local schools. The sky is truly the limit. This situation allows for some public school districts to have facilities that rival those of elite private universities, while other districts struggle to keep the furnace running, and there are a great many districts that fall somewhere in between. By law, then, our system of public education generates unequal amounts of funding for schools, and the amount of funding available to many schools is tied to local wealth. Another law that coexists with school funding laws is compulsory attendance. For a number of very good reasons, if you are under the age of 18, you need to be in school of some kind. While this is a good thing in many ways, when combined with school funding policies, in effect, we force children by mandate of law to attend unequal schools. This may not be the primary intent of these laws, but when taken together, inequality in education is an unavoidable effect to some degree in virtually all U.S. states. A system of public education that is structured this way puts groups of people in a form of indirect conflict with each other. In other words, this system is working really well for some communities, and it's not working really well at all for others. Class-based and racial segregation in housing and schooling can isolate these groups from each other as well. For wealthier districts, students, families, and educators often take for granted the posh facilities, high-tech tools, and qualified teachers that their local resources provide. And they often feel entitled to the best education money can buy, given it's their tax dollars that fund it. Any suggestion that any portion of their tax dollars be spent elsewhere for schools that need it is often seen as something being taken away from them. Indeed, there is often a deeply held belief, especially among people in well-resourced districts, that local tax dollars should stay in local communities. But for poorer districts, this system means that students, families, and educators struggle with facilities that are often overcrowded, uncomfortable, and unhealthy. They have limited access to relevant technology, and they may be lucky if their teachers are even certified in their subject matter. For students in these communities to have anything close to an equal educational opportunity as their peers in wealthier districts, their schools need additional resources from somewhere other than local tax revenue, because it just isn't enough. Socially structured inequalities like these are not always obvious to people in everyday life, but that doesn't make them any less real or consequential. Social structures enable and constrain behavior, and they shape the opportunities some people have, as well as the opportunities some people don't have. Let's take another example to highlight how structured inequalities work. Think about the college application process. Fun, wasn't it? You spend years working hard in school to get good grades, prepare for and take and possibly retake tests like the ACT, and devote countless hours to extracurriculars and volunteer work, all of which cut into the time you could devote to a Fortnite or TikTok. You go on campus visits, you write personal essays, you fret over where you might get accepted. Then, at last, you're in. Congrats. But does everyone who applies to selective colleges and universities get into those colleges and universities? No. By definition, there are winners and losers in this game. Not everyone goes to college. Only about 40% of people between the ages of 18 and 24, to put a number on it. Now, how many of you were explicitly going through some version of the following thought process while you were doing all that work to get into a good college? Okay, I'm going to study really hard. I'm going to get good grades. I'm going to slave over AP classes. I'm going to overextend myself in extracurriculars. I'm going to volunteer at nursing homes even though old people make me really uncomfortable. And when I do, I'm going to ensure that someone somewhere doesn't get into college and it ruins their life. No, of course not. What I just described never even occurs to you, let alone serve as some overarching motivating force driving your behavior for years. It's irrelevant. At least it can really seem that way. You were just doing what people expected you to. You were just following the rules. Rules that you've heard repeated thousands and thousands of times for as long as you can remember. Do well in school, get good grades, go to college, go to grad school, pursue a career, be successful. That's just what people do. That's how social structures go unnoticed. We learn to take them for granted. We're just following the rules, doing what we're expected to do. That's just the way it is. When we operate that way, though, it's easy to ignore the fact that the rules affect different people differently and shape their opportunities. For people in wealthier districts, just following the rules, just getting up and going to school every day, working hard toward college, for them, that means going to a nice building where there are science labs, field trips, AP and dual credit classes, college fairs, and standard issue tablets with Google Suite installed and ready to use. For other people, attempting to do the exact same thing, getting up and going to school every day means going to a building that may or may not be climate controlled that day, that has metal detectors at every entrance, that has 30 plus students per classroom, that doesn't have updated labs or digital tech, and that may not even have a certified teacher in each room. The opportunities available to students in different schools serving different communities are not the same as those available to other students in other schools serving other communities. That's not an accident. It's structured that way by our own policies, our own rules. And if we want to even begin attempting to address inequalities like these, we need to first cultivate our ability to understand how social structures work.